You. Oh, what's up? Here you go.
Oh, nice. Nice.
I know, that's a classic pencil right there. I know, that was classic. Need a pencil, Daryl? I guess you just don't like your family, huh?
No, I don't.
Yeah.
Kind of.
Yeah.
Depends what you're talking about. No.
Yeah, fair enough. All right, everyone seems good. All right, everyone's good. You have a blank piece of paper, and you have a pen or pencil, yes? Okay, cool. For the next quarter, we're going to be taking an in-depth look at the book of Esther. Now, this classroom is covering post-exilic history, which is just whatever happens after the Jewish people return from Babylonian and Persian exile, right? I originally was going to go in chronological order because Esther's a little bit after like Ezra and Nehemiah, but then I was like, I'm just in the mood. I was just in the mood for Esther. It's just a fascinating book, so we're doing Esther to start. Why you have that paper in front of you is I experienced this in a classroom setting, and it was really helpful for just my personal studies, and then for the rest of the discussion and study in the book of Esther was, we're going to read the whole story. And this is probably the only time, or one of the few times you'll hear this, is I don't want you to follow along. I can't force you, but I prefer you don't follow along in your Bible, actually, even. I'd prefer that, yeah, I know, shocking stuff, right? Close your Bibles, never hear that in church. Usually it'd be a bad sign, but I'm just going to read Esther, and some of us may be quite familiar with the story. It may be brand new to some of us, kind of be fuzzy. I remember just sitting and listening to the story and being surprised at a bunch of things. So all I want you to do with your blank piece of paper this evening is to, if you got a comment or a question, go ahead, jot that down. But for sure, pay attention to the patterns and the things that pop. I want you to write down, that's interesting. This theme keeps coming up. This word, this phrase keeps being repeated. I want you, as you listen to the story of Esther, to just write that down. And the last 10, 15 minutes that we should have at the end of the class, then I want to hear from you guys. Okay, what did you notice when you heard the whole thing read out loud? I think a lot of us know, to ancient Israel and even the first few hundred years especially, and even most of just church history, like you just heard the scriptures read. So that's what we're doing here with Esther. So look for themes and whatnot, and some of you are going to chuckle when I say this. Look for God in the story. Okay, where do you see God, faith? Where do you see any of that in Esther? Take note of that as you listen to this story for sure. And then I want to hear back from you guys the last 10 minutes or so. So if you can, just listen to the story. Esther is a story, this would make for a good movie. There is a popular movie out there that I've seen, and I'll just spoil it for you. I didn't like it. You guys may or may not have seen it. They took a lot of interpretive liberties, and I think bluntly kind of missed a lot of points. I think Esther gets sanitized and then kind of skipped over on the second half. We'll talk about that as we go through it here. But just listen and note what you're hearing. Anyone else need a blank piece of paper or a pencil? Because I'm actually asking you to close that Bible and to just listen to the story tonight as rare as it goes. Everyone's good on a blank piece of paper? Okay, so write down what you hear that's repeated. Esther would be a great Hollywood movie, like I was saying. You've got romance, and these are all adults in here, some sexual tension and strange things going on there. You've got war and assassination attempts and great banquets and kingdoms and feasts and princesses and executions and rivalries and humor. This story, hopefully you realize listening to it, is hilarious. Esther is funny. It's really funny. This is hopefully a captivating story. I just want you guys to write down what pops, what themes get repeated, and then we'll talk the end of the class. I want to hear from you guys. Hey, what stood out? What are some patterns? And that'll send us to the rest of our study this quarter, looking at Esther. Okay, it's like story time, right? This is from God's holy word. Okay, here's Esther. Here's the story. The following events happened in the days of Ahasuerus. I'm referring to that Ahasuerus who used to rule over 127 provinces, extending all the way from India to Ethiopia. In those days, as King Ahasuerus sat in his royal throne in Susa, the citadel, in the 3rd year of his reign, he provided a banquet for all his officials and his servants. The army of Persia and Media was present, as well as the nobles and the officials of the provinces. He displayed the riches of his royal glory and the splendor of his majestic greatness for a lengthy period of time, 180 days to be exact. When those days were completed, the king then provided a 7-day banquet for all the people who were present in Susa, the citadel, for those of the highest standing to the most lowly. It was held in the court located in the garden of the royal palace. The furnishings included white linen and blue curtains hung by cords of the finest linen and purple wool on silver rings and alabaster columns and gold and silver couches displayed on a floor made of valuable stones of alabaster, mother of pearl, and mineral stone. Drinks were served in golden containers, all of which differed from one another. Royal wine was available in abundance at the king's expense. There were no restrictions on the drinking, for the king had instructed all his supervisors that they should do as everyone so desired. Queen Vashti also gave a banquet for the women in King Ahasuerus' royal palace. On the 7th day, as King Ahasuerus was feeling the effects of the wine, he ordered Mehuman, Biztha, Ravana, Bigtha, Abatha, Zethar, and Carcass, the 7 eunuchs who attended to him, to bring Queen Vashti into the king's presence, wearing her royal high turban. He wanted to show the people and the officials her beauty, for she was very attractive. But Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's bidding conveyed through the eunuchs. Then the king became extremely angry, and his rage consumed him. The king then inquired of the wise men who were discerners of the times, for it was the royal custom to confer with all those who were proficient in laws and legalities. Those who were closest to him were Karshena, Shethar, Admatha, Tarshish, Meres, Marsina, and Memucan. These were the 7 officials of Persia and Media who saw the king on a regular basis and had the most prominent offices in the kingdom. The king asked, by law, what should be done to Queen Vashti in light of the fact that she has not obeyed the instructions of King Ahasuerus that he conveyed through the eunuchs? Memucan replied to the king and the officials, the wrong of Queen Vashti is not against the king alone, but against all the officials and all the people who are throughout all the provinces of King Ahasuerus. For the matter concerning the queen will spread to all the women, leading them to treat their husbands with contempt, saying, when King Ahasuerus gave orders to bring Queen Vashti into his presence, she would not come. And this very day, the noble ladies of Persia and Media who have heard of the matter concerning the queen will respond in the same way to all the royal officials, and there will be more than enough contempt and anger. If the king is so inclined, let a royal edict go forth from him, and let it be written in the laws of Persia and Media that cannot be repealed, that Vashti may not come into the presence of King Ahasuerus, and let the king convey her royalty to another who is more deserving than she. And let the king's decision that he will enact be disseminated throughout all his kingdom, vast though it is. Then all the women will give honor to their husbands, from the most prominent to the lowly. The matter seemed appropriate to the king and the officials, so the king acted on the advice of Memucan. And the letters were sent throughout all the royal provinces, to each province according to its own script, and to which each people according to their own language, that every man should be ruling his family and should be speaking the language of his own people. Now, when these things had been accomplished, and the rage of King Ahasuerus had diminished, he remembered Vashti, and what she had done, and what had been decided against her. The king's servants who attended him said, let a search be conducted on the king's behalf for attractive young women, and let the king appoint officers throughout all provinces of his kingdom to gather all the attractive young women to Susa the citadel, to the harem under the authority of Haggai, and the king's eunuch who oversees the women. Let him provide whatever cosmetics they desire. Let the young women whom the king finds most attractive become queen in place of Vashti. This seemed like a good idea to the king, so he acted accordingly. Now there happened to be a Jewish man in Susa, the citadel, whose name was Mordecai. He was the son of Jair, the son of Shammai, the son of Kish, a Benjaminite, who had been taken into exile from Jerusalem with the captives, who had been carried into exile when Jeconiah, king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, had taken into exile. Now he was acting as the guardian of Hadassah, that is, Esther, the daughter of his uncle, for neither her father nor her mother was alive. This young woman was very attractive and had a beautiful figure. When her father and mother died, Mordecai had raised her as if she were his own daughter. It so happened that when the king's edict and his law became known, many young women were taken to Susa the citadel to be placed under the authority of Hegai. Esther also was taken to the royal palace to be under the authority of Hegai, who was overseeing the women. This young woman pleased him, and she found favor with him. He quickly provided her with the cosmetics and her rations. He also provided her with the 7 especially chosen young women who were from the palace. He then transferred her and her young women to the best quarters in the harem. Now, Esther had not disclosed her people or her lineage, for Mordecai had instructed her not to do so. And the day after day, Mordecai used to walk back and forth in front of the court of the harem in order to learn how Esther was doing and what might happen to her. And at the end of 12 months that were required for the women, when the turn of each young woman arrived to go to King Ahasuerus, for in this way they had to fulfill their time of cosmetic treatment, 6 months of oil and myrrh and 6 months with perfume and various ointments used by women, the woman would go into the king in the following way. Whatever she asked for would be provided for her to take with her from the harem to the royal palace. In the evening she went, and in the morning she returned to a separate part of the harem, to the authority of Sahagaz, the king's eunuch who was overseeing the concubines. She would not go back to the king unless the king was pleased with her, and she was requested by name. When it became the turn of Esther, daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, who had raised her as if she were his own daughter, to go to the king, she did not request anything except what Hegai, the king's eunuch, who was the overseer of the women, had recommended. Yet Esther met with approval of all who saw her. Then Esther was taken to King Ahasuerus at his royal residence in the 10th month, that is the month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign. And the king loved Esther more than all the other women, and she met with his loving approval more than all the other young women. So he placed the royal turban on her head and appointed her queen in place of Vashti. Then the king prepared a large banquet for all his officials and his servants. It was actually Esther's banquet. He also set aside a holiday for the provinces, and he provided for offerings at the king's expense. Now, when the young women were being gathered again, Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate. Esther was still not divulging her lineage or her people, just as Mordecai had instructed her. Esther continued to do whatever Mordecai said, just as she had done when he was raising her. In those days, when Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, Bigthan and Teresh, 2 of the king's eunuchs who protected the entrance, became angry and plotted to assassinate King Ahasuerus. When Mordecai learned of the conspiracy, he informed Queen Esther, and Esther told the king in Mordecai's name. The king then had the matter investigated, and finding it to be so, he had the 2 conspirators hanged on a gallows. It was then recorded in the daily chronicles in the king's presence. Now, sometime later, King Ahasuerus promoted Haman, or we'll say Haman. The King Ahasuerus promoted Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, exalting him and setting his position above that of all the officials who were with him. As a result, the king's servants who were at the king's gate were bowing and paying homage to Haman, for the king had so commanded. However, Mordecai did not bow, nor did he pay him homage. Then the servants of the king who were at the king's gate asked Mordecai, "Why are you violating the king's commandment?" And after they had spoken to him day after day, without his paying any attention to them, they informed Haman to see whether this attitude on Mordecai's part would be permitted. Furthermore, he had disclosed to them that he was a Jew. When Haman saw that Mordecai was not bowing or paying homage to him, he was filled with rage. But the thought of striking out against Mordecai alone was repugnant to him, for he had been informed of the identity of Mordecai's people. So Haman sought to destroy all the Jews, that is, the people of Mordecai, who were all in the kingdom of Ahasuerus. And the first month, that is the month of Nisan, in the 12th year of King Ahasuerus reigned Pur, that is, the lot. The Pur was cast before Haman in order to determine a day and a month. It turned out to be the 12th month, that is, the month of Adar. Then Haman said to King Ahasuerus, "There's a particular people that is dispersed and spread among the inhabitants throughout all the provinces of your kingdom, whose laws differ from those of all other peoples. Furthermore, they do not observe the king's laws. It's not appropriate for the king to provide a haven for them. If the king is so inclined, let an edict be issued to destroy them. I will pay 10,000 talents of silver to be conveyed to the king's treasuries of the officials who carry out this business." So the king removed his signet ring from his hand, and he gave it to Haman, the son of Hammedatha the Agagite, who was hostile toward the Jews. The king replied to Haman, "Keep your money and do with those people whatever you wish." So the royal scribes were summoned in the first month on the 13th day of the month. Everything Haman commanded was written to the king's satraps and governors who were in every province, and to the officials of every people, the province by province according to its script, and people by their own language. And in the name of King Ahasuerus it was written and sealed with the king's signet ring. Letters were sent by the runners to all the king's provinces, stating that they should destroy, kill, annihilate all the Jews, from youth to elderly, both women and children, on a particular day, namely the 13th day of the 12th month, that is, the month of Adar, and to loot and plunder their possessions. A copy of this edict was to be presented as law throughout every province. It was to be made known to all the inhabitants so that they would be prepared for this day. The messenger scurried forth with the king's order. The edict was issued in Susa, the citadel, while the king and Haman sat down to drink. The city of Susa was in an uproar. Now, when Mordecai became aware of all that had been done, he tore his garments and put on sackcloth and ashes, and he went out into the city, crying aloud in a bitter voice. But he went no farther than the king's gate, for no one was permitted to enter the king's gate clothed in sackcloth. Throughout each and every province where the king's edict and law was announced, there was a considerable mourning among the Jews, along with fasting, weeping, and sorrow. Sackcloth and ashes were characteristic of many. When Esther's female attendants and her eunuchs came and informed her about Mordecai's behavior, the queen was overcome with anguish. Although she sent garments for Mordecai to put them on so he could remove the sackcloth, he would not accept them. So Esther called for Hathach, one of the king's eunuchs who had been placed at her service, and instructed him to find out the cause and the reason for Mordecai's behavior. So Hathach went to Mordecai at the plaza of the city in front of the king's gate, and Mordecai related to him everything that had happened to him, even the specific amount of money that Haman had offered to pay to the king's treasuries for the Jews to be destroyed. He also gave him a written copy of the law that had been sent out in Susa for their destruction so that he could show it to Esther and talk to her about it. He also gave instructions that she should go to the king to implore him and petition him on behalf of her people. So Hathach returned and related Mordecai's instruction to Esther. Then Esther replied to Hathach with instructions from Mordecai. All the servants of the king and the people of the king's provinces know that there is only one law applicable to any man or woman who comes uninvited to the king in the inner court. That person will be put to death, unless the king extends to him the gold scepter, permitting him to be spared. Now I have not been invited to come to the king in some 30 days. When Esther's reply was conveyed to Mordecai, he said to take back this answer to Esther. Don't imagine that because you're part of the king's household that you will be the one Jew who will escape. If you keep quiet at this time, liberation and protection for the Jews will appear from another source while you and your father's household perish. It may very well be that you have achieved royal status for such a time as this. Then Esther sent this reply to Mordecai. Go, assemble all the Jews who are found in Susa and fast on my behalf. Don't eat and don't drink for 3 days, night or day. My female attendants and I will also fast in the same way. Afterwards, I will go to the king, even though it violates the law. And if I perish, I perish." So Mordecai set out to do everything that Esther had instructed him. It so happened that on the third day, Esther put on her royal attire and stood in the inner court of the palace, opposite of the king's quarters. The king was sitting on his royal throne in the palace, opposite the entrance. And when the king saw Queen Esther standing in the court, she met him with his approval. The king extended to Esther the gold scepter that was in his hand, and Esther approached and touched the end of the scepter. And the king said to her, "What is on your mind, Queen Esther? What is your request? Even as much as half the kingdom will be given to you." Esther replied, "If the king is so inclined, let the king and Haman come today to the banquet that I've prepared for the king." The king replied, "Find Haman quickly so that we can do as Esther requests." So the king and Haman went to the banquet that Esther had prepared. And while at the banquet of wine, the king said to Esther, "What is your request? It shall be given to you. What is your petition? Ask for as much as half of the kingdom, and it shall be done." Esther responded, "My request and my petition is this. If I found favor in the king's sight, and if the king is inclined to grant my request and approve my petition, let the king and Haman come tomorrow to the banquet that I will prepare for them, and at that time I will do as the king wishes." Now Haman went forth that day, pleased and very much encouraged. But when Haman saw Mordecai at the king's gate, and how he did not rise or tremble in his presence, Haman was filled with rage toward Mordecai. But Haman restrained himself and went on to his home. He then sent for his friends to join him along with his wife Zeresh. Haman then recounted to them his fabulous wealth, his many sons, and how the king had magnified him and exalted him over every other of the king's officials and servants. Haman said, "Furthermore, Queen Esther invited only me to accompany the king to the banquet that she prepared, and also tomorrow I'm invited along with the king. Yet all this fails to satisfy me so as long as I have to see Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gate." Haman's wife Zeresh and all his friends said to him, "Have a gallows 75 feet high built, and in the morning tell the king that Mordecai should be hanged on it. Then go with the king to the banquet contented." It seemed like a good idea to Haman, so he had the gallows built. Now throughout the night, the king was unable to sleep. So he asked for the book containing the historical records to be brought. As the records were being read in the king's presence, it was found written that Mordecai had disclosed that Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs who had guarded the entrance, had plotted to assassinate King Ahasuerus. The king asked, "What great honor was bestowed on Mordecai because of this?" The king's attendants who served him responded, "Not a thing was done for him." Then the king said, "Who's that in the courtyard?" Now Haman had come to the outer courtyard of the palace to suggest that the king hang Mordecai on the gallows that he had constructed for him. The king's attendant said to him, "It is Haman who's standing in the courtyard." The king said, "Let him enter." So Haman came in, and the king said to him, "What should be done for the man whom the king wishes to honor?" And Haman thought to himself, "Well, who is it that the king would want to honor more than me?" So Haman said to the king, "For the man whom the king wishes to honor, let them bring royal attire, which the king himself has worn, and a horse on which the king himself has ridden, one bearing the royal insignia. And then let this clothing and let the horse be given to the one of the king's noble officials. Let him then clothe the man whom the king wishes to honor, and let him lead him through the plaza of the city on the horse, calling before him, 'So shall it be done to the man whom the king wishes to honor.'" The king said to Haman, "Go quickly, take the clothing and the horse just as you've described, and do just as you indicated to Mordecai the Jew who sits at the king's gate. Don't neglect a single thing in all that you've said." So Haman took the clothing and the horse, and he clothed Mordecai, and he led him about on the horse throughout the plaza of the city, calling before him, "So shall it be done to the man whom the king wishes to honor." Then Mordecai again sat at the king's gate while Haman hurried away to his home, mournful, with a veil over his head. Haman then related to his wife Zeresh and to all his friends everything that had happened to him. And then these wise men, along with his wife Zeresh, said to him, "If indeed this Mordecai before whom you have begun to fall is Jewish, you will not prevail against him. No, you will surely fall before him." And while they were still speaking with him, the king's eunuchs arrived. They quickly brought Haman to the banquet that Esther had prepared. So the king and Haman came to dine with Queen Esther. And on the second day of the banquet of wine, the king asked Esther, "What is your request, Queen Esther? It shall be granted to you. And what is your petition? Ask for up to half the kingdom, and it shall be done." Queen Esther replied, "If I have met you with your approval, O king, and if the king is so inclined, grant me my life as my request, and my people as my petition. For we have been sold, both I and my people, to destruction, and to slaughter, and to annihilation. If we had simply been sold as male and female slaves, I would have remained silent, for such distress would not have been sufficient for troubling the king." Then King Ahasuerus responded to Queen Esther, "Who is this individual? Where is this person to be found who's so presumptuous enough to act in this way?" Esther replied, "The oppressor and enemy is this evil Haman." Then Haman became terrified in the presence of the king and queen. Enraged, the king arose from the banquet of wine and withdrew to the palace garden. Meanwhile, Haman stood to beg Queen Esther for his life, for he realized that the king had now determined a catastrophic end for him. And when the king returned from the palace garden to the banquet of wine, Haman was throwing himself down on the couch where Esther was lying. And the king exclaimed, "Will he also attempt to rape the queen while I am still in the building?" As these words left the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. Harbana, one of the king's eunuchs, said, "Indeed, there is the gallows that Haman made for Mordecai, who spoke out on the king's behalf. It stands near Haman's home. It's 75 feet high." Then the king said, "Hang him on that." So they hanged Haman on the very gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai, and the king's rage was then abated. Now on that same day, King Ahasuerus gave the estate of Haman, that adversary of the Jews, to Queen Esther. Now Mordecai had come before the king, for Esther had revealed how he was related to her. And the king then removed his signet ring, the very one that he had taken back from Haman, and gave it to Mordecai. And Esther designated Mordecai to be in charge of Haman's estate. Then Esther again spoke with the king, falling at his feet. She wept and begged him for mercy, that he might nullify the evil of Haman the Agagite and the plot that he had intended against the Jews. And when the king extended to Esther the golden scepter, she rose and stood before the king. She said, "If the king's so inclined, and if I've met him with his approval, and if the matter is agreeable to the king, and if I'm attractive to him, let an edict be written rescinding those recorded intentions of Haman, the son of Hammedatha the Agagite, which he wrote in order to destroy the Jews, who are throughout all the king's provinces. For how can I watch the calamity that will befall my people? And how can I watch the destruction of my relatives?" King Ahasuerus replied to Queen Esther and to Mordecai the Jew, "Look, I've already given Haman's estate to Esther, and he's been hanged on the gallows because he took hostile action against the Jews. Now write in the king's name whatever in your opinion is appropriate concerning the Jews, and seal it with the king's signet ring. Any decree that is written in the king's name and sealed with the king's signet ring cannot be rescinded." The king's scribes were quickly summoned. And in the 3rd month, that is the month of Sivan, and the 23rd day, they wrote out everything that Mordecai instructed to the Jews, and to the satraps, and to the governors, and the officials of the provinces, all the way from India to Ethiopia, 127 provinces in all, to each province in its own script, and to each people in their own language, and to the Jews according to their own script and their own language. Mordecai wrote in the name of King Ahasuerus and sealed it with the king's signet ring. He then sent letters by couriers who rode royal horses, who were very swift. The king thereby allowed the Jews who were in every city to assemble and to stand up for themselves, to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate any army of whatever people or province that should become of their adversaries, including their women and children, and to confiscate their property. This was to take place on a certain day throughout all the provinces of King Ahasuerus, namely on the 13th day of the 12th month, that is, the month of Adar. A copy of the edict was to be presented as law throughout each and every province and made known to all peoples, so that the Jews might be prepared on that day to avenge themselves on their enemies. The couriers who were riding out on the royal horses went forth with the king's edict without delay, and the law was presented in Susa the citadel as well. Now, Mordecai went out from the king's presence in blue and white royal attire, with a large golden crown and a purple linen mantle. And the city of Susa shouted with joy, for the Jews there was radiant with happiness and with joyous honor. Throughout every province, throughout every city where the king's edict and his law arrived, the Jews experienced happiness and joy and had banquets and holidays. Many of the resident peoples pretended to be Jews because the fear of the Jews had overcome them. Now in the 12th month, that is the month of Adar, on the 13th day, the edict of the king and his law were to be executed. It was on this day that the enemies of the Jews had supposed that they would gain power over them, but contrary to expectations, the Jews gained power over their enemies. The Jews assembled themselves in their cities throughout all the provinces of King Ahasuerus to strike out against those who were seeking their harm. No one was able to stand before them, for dread of them fell on all the peoples. And all the officials of the provinces, the satraps, the governors, and those who performed the king's business were assisting the Jews, for the dread of Mordecai had fallen on them. Mordecai was of high rank in the king's palace, and the word about him was spreading throughout all the provinces. His influence continued to become greater and greater. The Jews struck all their enemies with the sword, bringing death and destruction, and they did as they pleased with their enemies. In Susa, the citadel, the Jews killed and destroyed 500 men. In addition, they also killed Parsandatha, Dalphon, Alphana, Poratha, Adalia, Adadatha, Parmstha, Adasai, Adadai, and Vasathia, the 10 sons of Haman, son of Hamadath, the enemy of the Jews. But they did not confiscate their property. On that same day, the number of those killed in Susa, the citadel, were brought to the king's attention. Then the king said to Queen Esther, in Susa, the citadel, the Jews have killed and destroyed 500 men and the 10 sons of Haman. What then have they done in the rest of the king's provinces? What is your request? It shall be given to you. What other petition do you have? It shall be done. Esther replied, if the king is so inclined, let the Jews who are in Susa be permitted to act tomorrow, also according to today's law, and let them hang the 10 sons of Haman on the gallows. So the king issued orders for this to be done. And a law was passed in Susa, and the 10 sons of Haman were hanged. The Jews who were in Susa then assembled on the 14th day of the month of Adar, and they killed 300 men in Susa, but they did not confiscate their property. The rest of the Jews who were throughout the provinces of the king assembled in order to stand up for themselves and to have rest from their enemies. They killed 75,000 of their adversaries, but they did not confiscate their property. All this happened on the 13th day of the month of Adar. They then rested on the 14th day and made it a day for banqueting and happiness. But the Jews who were in Susa assembled on the 13th and 14th days and rested on the 15th, making it a day of banqueting and happiness. This is why the Jews who are in the rural country, that is, those in rural villages, set aside the 14th day of the month of Adar for happiness, banqueting, and holiday, sending gifts to one another. Mordecai wrote these matters down and sent letters to all the Jews who were throughout all provinces of King Ahasuerus, both near and far, to have them observe the 14th and 15th days of the month of Adar each year, as a time when the Jews gave themselves rest from their enemies, the month when their trouble was turned to happiness and their mourning to a holiday. These were to be days of banqueting, happiness, sending gifts to one another, and providing for the poor. So the Jews committed themselves to continuing in what they had begun to do and what Mordecai had written to them. For Haman, the son of Hammedatha the Agagite, the enemy of all the Jews, had devised plans against the Jews to destroy them. He had cast Pur, that is, the lot, in order to afflict and destroy them. But when the matter had come to the king's attention, the king gave written orders that Haman's evil intentions that he had devised against the Jews should fall on his own head. He and his sons were hanged in the gallows. And for this reason, these days are known as Purim, after the name of Pur. Therefore, because of the account found in this letter and what they had faced in this regard and what had happened to them, the Jews established as binding on themselves, their descendants, and all who joined their company, that they should observe these 2 days without fail, just as it was written at the appropriate time on an annual basis. These days were to be remembered and to be celebrated in every generation and in every family, every province, and in every city. The Jews were not to fail to observe these days of Purim. The remembrance of them was not to cease among their descendants. So Queen Esther, the daughter of Abihail and Mordecai, the Jew, wrote with full authority to confirm this second letter about Purim. Letters were sent to all the Jews in the 127 provinces of the empire of Ahasuerus, words of true peace, to establish these days of Purim in the proper times, just as Mordecai the Jew and Queen Esther had established. And just as they had established both for themselves and their descendants, matters pertaining to fasting and lamentation. Esther's command established these matters of Purim, and the matter was officially recorded. King Ahasuerus then imposed forced labor on the land and on the coastlands of the sea. Now, all the actions carried out under his authority and his great achievements, along with the exact statement concerning the greatness of Mordecai, whom the king promoted, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Media and Persia? Mordecai the Jew was second only to King Ahasuerus. He was the highest ranking Jew, and he was admired by his numerous relatives. He worked enthusiastically for the good of his people and was an advocate for the welfare of all his descendants. And there's the story of Esther. Now, I don't know about you, when you hear that story read all the way through, you kind of forget just how much more of Esther there is after like the main part, right? Haman gets hung on the gallows and you're like, that's the end of the story. No, there's a lot more there at the end. So I want to hear from you guys with the last 10 minutes or so we got here. What popped out to you? Okay, themes, literary themes, maybe it was just repeated words, phrases, patterns. What popped out to you guys? Just listening to the whole story read out. What stood out? Ricky?
The attitude of the king.
What about it? About King
He thought he was this ultimate reign, he was the man.
King Ahasuerus, he thinks a lot of himself, for sure.
He's very highly, and it's an attitude that you see with all the kings around the Jews. Had the same, I'm all that. Look at what I can do.
Yeah, there's definitely
at any time.
Definitely a lot of pride in Ahasuerus. Okay, what else stood out? Yeah, Brett.
Well, just the author writes with great flourish and description. I mean, there's so much detail. You have a full and complete picture of everything that's going on and what motives are and what the court is like and what the times were like and everything. It's an astounding level of detail when you hear it read to yourself.
Yeah, there's a lot of detail. Almost sounds like they had a connection with an eyewitness. There's so much detail, right? There's a lot of detail, yes. Okay, what else stood out? Themes and patterns, Josh?
Something that stood out to me was God's timing and protection, not only of Esther, of his people. I mean, even when you get to the conversation that Haman had with his friends and his wife, and at the same time, the king is having a dream that turns him in the opposite direction, and it's just it would make a fabulous play. It's just
yes, like
wonderful.
I said, this would be a great play, great movie. That's a good point about providence. Do you have your hand up? Yes, please.
Yeah. It is an incredible story of the book of Esther. The words banquet, king, eunuch, and Mordecai were mentioned more than once.
Yeah, more than once to say the least. Yes, there's a lot of words repeated. Okay, what else is repeated and things like that? What else, guys?
7. That was all the.
Ooh, yes. Yeah, the Bible loves the number 7. Very much so does. Yes, 7 is snuck in there a few times. Okay, what else? What other things were repeated that popped out to you? This side over here. Yeah, Connor.
Well, the phrase Haman fell on his head. I thought that was nice.
That's funny. He falls on his own head.
But,
yes. Continue.
Yeah, I mean, I was just kind of like floored by like the extravagance of everything. Like there was like no expense like wasted.
No.
Like.
Yeah. Well,
the cosmetics were mentioned a lot. Like they were like, we'll provide the cosmetics for all these women. I like how Esther was lovingly approved. Like she was just like by everybody,
Yeah,
approved by everybody, lovingly approved. And the king seemed like when that signet ring went out, like he didn't care what was said on that.
That's a very astute point.
So like, I love another point that was like he said like, this is like what is said on this can't be undone.
Can't be undone.
But he's just like done it 3 times, and it was a good reversal.
Yes. Yeah, you guys remember what's the other famous story about the law can't be undone? Almost. Yeah. So Nebuchadnezzar's Babylonian, and then you get to then the Persians take over. Right. This is the Medo-Persian Empire, and we'll talk about how Mordecai undoes the law at the very end when we get there. But yeah, you can't undo the law in the Medo-Persian Empire. The king says it goes. It was also a very astute point you said that the king, it's like he doesn't learn his lesson at the very end. Even though Mordecai is like better, obviously, he just is like, yeah, whatever. He's just handing out blank checks all the time.
But like, it was like so like all these provinces in every language and
Yes.
with the swiftest horses.
Mm-hmm.
So it's pretty funny.
Very pomp. Yes. What else stood out to you guys? Yes, Kim. Oh, you got a lot of notes. Let's hear your sheet you got on here. But go ahead.
Well, I was thinking about, I don't have a really great way to say it, but every time we see battles in the Old Testament or wars that need to be won, it's never in the way that as humans we think things are going to be won. And at some point it said that that everyone was so afraid of the Jews. They were overcome with fear, and it made me think of them being in Egypt. And, God has such a way of doing things that we wouldn't even expect, right? We wouldn't even expect how the Egyptians were so generous in giving their gold, and that was going to be the end of, the end of them seeing those people. And here, instead of immediately this great battle coming out, it's like everyone's just afraid of them. I mean, all of these people, they already explained multiple times how big this territory is and how the fear of them spread. And it's just the way God wins certain battles is always different than how man would have created it in our minds.
Very much so. Very much so. But speaking of God, how about God in this story? You guys, anyone notice how God is not mentioned? I'm sure I know somebody. This is the only book in the canon of Scripture where there's no Elohim, there's no God, there's no Yahweh, there's no Adonai, there's no Lord even. There's nothing about God. There's nothing about Moses or anyone. The closest thing, what was the closest thing to getting anything that would be religiously Jewish about God? What was the closest things that you'd say that you heard in the story where it was like, oh, that's God, right? Yeah, what was the closest to that, Josh?
Well, I would say when Mordecai was talking to Esther and said, maybe you're here for such a time as this, but even if you don't, there will be another.
Yes.
He will save.
There was a hint of his faith. Yeah, that was interesting. What else? Where else did you see God or the Jewish religion in Esther?
Well, I was struck that there was no prayer appeal to God, by the Jewish people, but they did fast.
Yes.
And which is an act that he's prescribed as a way to demonstrate your earnestness of your appeal.
Yes. That's another astute point. Anything else where you saw God or the Jews' religion in this book? It's not only book where God is not explicitly mentioned. It's fascinating, isn't it? Okay, anything else generically that stood out to you guys? Any other patterns that caught your guys' attention? Chris, yes?
Just the themes of transactional nature, like you got to pay to play, or like there's this, you don't beat the messenger, but you're rewarded for paying homage, but punished for doing the same thing.
Yes,
for following instruction.
Yeah, you can see how that gets dangerous with the ego that was pointed out, and you can see the extreme honor-shame culture when it comes to dignitaries. Yes, what else, Mark? And then we'll come back to Brett.
Interesting coincidence that the king is just looking through the annals of time, and he just happens to coincidentally come across the whole story of how Mordecai exposed this.
Yes. Yeah, we'll talk more about that. That's that moment where a king in the middle of the night, that's the swing point. I'll show us all the chiastic structures and stuff in the coming weeks, but the swing point is right there in the middle of the night. And there's a lot of coincidences, right, as we would say. We're like, what's going on there? Brett?
Well, this is not a deep point to accompany some of those made. But is there anything better than when Vashti won't come to the king, that he tries to decide what to do, and his wives and tell him, you can't let word of this get out, or what's going to happen to women across the kingdom, right?
Yes.
I mean, that's just there's a lot of human nature shown in this book.
For sure.
And the sort of the intricacies of the court and all. So.
Yes. Is there a bell in here? Last comment, I think. That's the bell? Okay. There was a bell. Last comment here, and we'll be done with Connor.
You know, concealing the fact that you're a Jew was like a major part of the major theme in the beginning, but I do love, there was mention that others were pretending to be Jews at one point.
Yeah.
Which, so like after the thing, yeah.
That was funny. Yeah, the Jewishness is a key part of this story. Okay, you guys got the story in your brain. Doesn't hurt to go read it again. We're going to look at Esther chapter 1 next week. Thank you, guys.